My father, until his death, sold shoes, though not in a store on his knees with a shoehorn in his hand. He sold wholesale for various companies and made a decent enough living, though he never saved anything, and he never told me exactly why he had no claim to the family fortune, other than to show his bitterness sometimes when he had been drinking, by pulling out a tattered green copy of the Social Register to show me the names and addresses of all the Carters in it, pointing out the exclusive locations where they lived, the stars next to their names that marked an entirely other level of prestige, whose meaning I no longer recall. Of Mother, for her part, I have only vague memories, since she died when I was 6. I do remember a tall, dark-haired woman with a soft voice and a sad face, with deep brown eyes that made her look as if she were perpetually weeping. The last years of her life she spent primarily in bed, dying from a virulent form of bone cancer, and while it affected my life insofar as I grew up motherless, it affected my father much more, for she was his sun and his moon, and, after she died, he removed all evidence of her from our small ranch house, as if she never existed. Since my father was always working, and my mother was dead, I spent much of my childhood and adolescence alone, and I learned, in turn, how to take care of myself. I went to school, made friends, and in retrospect was a normal, if shy, boy. Upon high school graduation, I even went to college. Not something I was pushed to do, but something I thought I should do, and, without knowing what it was I wanted out of my future, I studied philosophy, which was a mistake, since it only taught me to move deeper into myself, something I did not need. Nevertheless, I was a competent, if unspectacular, student, and managed to graduate in 4 years, at which point I began waiting tables at Boston restaurants, and dating that city's daughters, a pattern I maintained until my father's death. And so it was that in the summer of 1996, with all the recumbent guilt that comes with losing a parent, I broke it off with yet another girlfriend, this time a tall, skinny divinity school student named Jill, and without much of a plan, but armed with a $10,000 inheritance, I packed my spare belongings into my Volkswagen and drove north from Boston to Vermont. I do not know what I hoped to find amid those green hills in midsummer. I suppose I hoped that instead of anchoring myself in the arms of a woman, and instead of floating ethereally in a world of graduate classes and serving dinner to Bostonians, I would somehow find in that dramatic landscape a way to ground myself in something honest and true, something that would allow me to get outside myself and my solipsism. I spent the first days in an econo lodge on the fringe of Montpelier, but by the end of the week I had found a rental house in the town of Eden. The house was in reality more of a cabin, a poorly built cabin at that. The landlord, a gruff, hard-drinking New York firefighter, someday wanted to retire here, but in the meantime rented it out for $500 a month. He had built it himself, but from scrap wood, he said, and it was a square structure with a small porch on the front and 2 giant windows on the second floor, storefront windows, salvaged when a local department store was razed, so that if you were to look at it head-on, the cabin resembled a large, benevolent face. Inside was a small kitchen, a living room beyond that with a wood stove, and then a wooden ladder that led to the upstairs loft, little more than a large, airy room, with the storefront windows on the south side. The cabin was built into the side of the hill, and from the porch and from the storefront windows, you could see clear across the valleys of Eden to the mountains in the distance, the curved horn of Camel's Hump interrupting the horizon at sunset. The land around the house was rocky, and soon gave way on all sides to a thick forest of poplars, eastern cottonwoods, maples, and evergreens. As the house was set down from the dirt road that ran along the ridge of the hill, you could see no other houses from it, and, though solitude of this kind seemed the wrong cure for my fears, it struck me as perfect for my needs. Out of the way, real, firmly in and of this earth. Those first months were a matter of adjustment. but I surprised myself by giving in to the rhythms of the place, waking with the sun, sleeping in a bed next to the storefront windows, underneath a canopy of stars in clear weather. During the days, I explored the town, first by car, driving around the endless dirt roads that dip and weave through those pitched valleys. I drove by old farmhouses, cows in pastures, pebbly mountain streams with thin waterfalls falling next to the road, run-down trailers tucked into the woods, abandoned cars stacked like pancakes next to them. I drove by old churches with old graveyards, the stones illegible with age. I drove by logging roads cut like seams into the forest, men with heavy equipment dragging the ash and pine down narrow escarpments to muddy clearings, long logs piled high for hauling. I drove by defunct mills, their wheels no longer turning, the clapboard peeling away from the frames. I drove by dirty-faced children playing on the sides of the road. I drove by an old woman wearing hip waders and standing in a child's plastic pool, a slaughtered pig at her feet. I drove by the mix of poor and country wealthy living side by side. I drove each day until I could not drive any more. I began to walk. Initially, I stuck to the roads, exploring the one I lived on, the surrounding roads. I walked with a big stick to ward off the various dogs that rushed out to meet me. Eventually, I grew bolder and began to cut directly into the woods themselves, egging myself on, forcing myself to face the fears of deep forest that anyone who has spent a lifetime in the city has. I walked through meadows of wildflowers, up steeply pitched forest walls, across mountain streams that had slowed to a trickle but that, from the looks of the beds, ran hard and fast with snowmelt in the spring. I walked up the sides of small mountains, above the tree lines, until I could see the undulating hills spread before me, ridges like waves frozen in time. At night, I sat on the porch of that ill-built cabin and watched the gathering dark. I smoked cigarettes and drank scotch and looked at the woods. I looked at the night sky, bright with stars, the moon sometimes sitting crescent-shaped above the mountains. From here I also watched the summer thunderclouds come over the hills, thick, black clouds, and then the rain in the forest, and then overhead, and then, sitting inside, listened to it pound on the tin roof. When the fall came, and the hills of Eden filled with gold and reds and purples, I decided I needed to find a job. For one thing, I spent all my time alone, and I had no friends here, and I needed something to give definition to my days during the winter. I had heard through the owner of the local general store that Mrs. Andrews, the woman who delivered the mail for the town, was retiring. Delivering the mail in Eden was unlike delivering mail anywhere else I had been. No uniform, no going door to door with a bag over your shoulder and a can of mace in one hand. No, it was rural delivery, and they gave you a car. In this case, an old Jeep with a steering wheel on the right side. It took about 6 hours in good weather to do the job, and this sounded about right to me. It seemed, curiously enough, to fit my circumstances. Hardly good work for the college-educated, but honest work nonetheless. Good work for a man trying to turn over leaves. I had to take the civil service exam in Montpelier, but I passed it easily, and in the third week of October 1996, I, Nathan Carter, loosely of the Boston Carters, became the mailman for the town of Eden, Vermont. And this is when Wallace Fisk and I first crossed paths. The Fisk house was something of a local landmark. Located at the base of a steep hill that contained what was considered the most dangerous road in Eden, it was one of the oldest in the town, built in the early part of the 18th century. Likewise, the Fisk family was one of Eden's oldest, and, though they were mostly hill farmers, their land was among the most coveted by the yuppies that had been moving in from Burlington for the past decade. They owned almost 300 acres, a mixture of woodlands and open pasture, and the house itself was a clapboard cape, and though it was run down, sinking in places into its foundation, it sat on a small knoll above a crystal blue pond called Mirror Lake that was located entirely on the Fisk land. From that house, as I would discover later, one looked down on the pond and to the hills beyond it, and to the line of mountains in the distance. Wallace Fisk was not a man who received a lot of